Of the Center for Latin American Studies. I'm Harley Shaken, chair of the center, and we're very pleased you're all here. We're very sorry this is the largest room we could get at this hour. The bad news is not everyone has gotten in. The good news is we hope to be bringing Denise Dresser back before too long to Berkeley. And this event will be on the Center for Latin American Studies website, class.berkeley.edu. For me, it's a real privilege and honor to introduce Professor Denise Dresser. She is a professor of political science at ITAM in Mexico City, a columnist for the magazine Proceso and for the daily newspaper Reforma, and has a long list of impressive professional accomplishments. But I think what is so unique about Denise Dresser is how over the years she has emerged as the preeminent public intellectual in Mexico through her writing, through her commenting, through her intervention in political life on both sides of the border. She has been both an exceptional scholar of these events and a public intellectual whose commentary has been razor sharp, very clear, and when necessary, unflinching in who she takes on and the arguments she raises. She's also, since January, addressed a session in Mexico organized by the Senate, a public session which is available for viewing on YouTube, which has become a minor classic, where she laid out a critique and a set of ideas about how Mexico could grow, particularly relevant in this economic crisis. She's also more recently testified before the U.S. Senate on issues related to the relationship with a focus on what's taking place on drugs on both sides of the border. She's going to speak, and then we will have time for questions and comments after her talk. Please join me in welcoming Professor Denise Dresser.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming to listen to me speak. As I reflect on my troubled country, the lyrics of a Bruce Springsteen song come to mind. We are far, far away from home. Our home is very far away from us. And that's how it feels to live in Mexico today during these turbulent times. Far from democratic normalcy, far from the rule of law, far from home and close to everything that imperils it. Always on the lookout, always suspicious, anxious, invaded by the legitimate fear of walking on the street after dark, taking money out of an ATM, hopping into a cab, being stopped by a corrupt policeman, receiving the call of a kidnapper saying that he has taken your child, burying a son, losing a daughter. My home has been a place where too many people die, gunned down by a drug trafficker, or assaulted by a robber, or shot by an ill-trained police officer, or kidnapped and strangled by a member of a criminal gang, as was the case with the teenage children of prominent businessmen Alejandro Martí and Nelson Vargas. In a country where over 7,000 people have died in drug-related violence over the last year, insecurity is top of mind for most Mexicans. And given the increasingly lawless conditions of the country he inherited, President Felipe Calderon had little choice but to act. The former ruling party that governed Mexico over 71 years in an authoritarian fashion left behind a toxic legacy. During the 1980s, drug trafficking blossomed throughout the country as a result of political protection. Drug traffickers infiltrated the Mexican government, frequently aided and abetted by members of the federal judicial police, as well as by state-level officials. The political structure built by the PRI provided a shell for organized crime that was able to swell not despite the government, but thanks to the blind eye it frequently turned. And dealing with a problem that has become more widespread and embedded than President Calderon had originally envisioned has not been easy, because the surge of drug trafficking in Mexico reflects a painful paradox. The government's drug enforcement efforts are undermined by the corrupting influence of the drug trade, yet the drug trade cannot survive without the protection of compromised elements in the government. Cocaine traffickers spend as much as $500 million a year on bribery, which is double the budget of the Mexican Attorney General's office. As a result, it frequently becomes difficult to distinguish those charged with smuggling from the smugglers themselves. Policemen regularly play dual roles. They act as drug enforcers and as drug smuggling protectors. In places like Tijuana and Chihuahua, the army has effectively been brought in to protect the population from the police. Mexico is a place where, if you are the victim of a crime, the last person you call is a police officer. In the face of police corruption, Felipe Calderon has turned to the military to take on the anti-drug effort. But bringing soldiers out of the barracks and moving them around the country at will is a cause for concern. As a result of its expanded role, the military is becoming the supreme authority, and in some cases, the only authority in parts of some states. And greater militarization is leading to greater corruption within an institution that has turned into the last credible beachhead in Mexico's long-standing battle. So using the military as a roving cleanup force may solve some short-term problems, but may also create some larger, intractable ones. In order to be more effective, Felipe Calderon and the Mexican government in general has to deal with Mexico's culture of illegality. Over the past decade, the surge of drug trafficking and Calderon's efforts to contain its effects are symptomatic of what doesn't work in Mexico's dysfunctional democracy. As George Orwell wrote, people denounce wars while preserving the type of society that makes them inevitable. Mexico has a political, economic, and political structure that makes crime possible. It is a country characterized by politicians who protect drug traffickers and drug traffickers who finance politicians, by those who launder money, and unregulated financial institutions that allow the practice to occur, by judges who become accomplices of criminals and criminals who can and do bribe them. And although Felipe Calderon has declared that he is winning the war against the drug mafias, the truth is that government institutions frequently shelter their members. Drug trafficking in Mexico is nurtured by extensive corruption and persistent impunity. It feeds upon a country where 85% of crimes are never reported due to lack of trust in the authorities, and where 98% of crimes are never resolved or punished. So while the president's efforts are to be at some level applauded, the prospect for a less insecure, more stable Mexico will be contingent on the government's capacity to effect a major overhaul of the judiciary and law enforcement apparatus. It will be dependent on the government's political will to confront corruption at the highest levels, something Calderon has been very reluctant to do. In other words, the president needs to fight not only drug traffickers, but also the political networks that protect them. Otherwise, Mexico will continue to combat symptoms while ignoring their causes. Now, Calderon has told the U.S. that the heightened level of violence is a result of government efficacy in combating drug cartels, that the rise in executions is sign of a firm hand and not an ineffectual one. But Calderon's stance, the stance that he is winning the war, is one that he is forced to maintain for domestic political imperatives, given the forthcoming election. That stance sidesteps the problems that cannot be dealt with more weapons, more bullets, more members of the military policing key cities, more blood on the streets, more simplistic solutions to complex problems. The current strategy, based on the increased militarization of Mexico, ignores high-level corruption that no one really wants to combat. It ignores a police force so weak, so ill-trained, so underpaid, and so infiltrated that good apples are spoiled by rotten ones. It ignores that an enhanced military presence is resulting in increased human rights abuses in a country where too many of them already occur. It ignores a concentrated, oligopolistic economic structure that thwarts growth and social mobility, forcing people across the border or into the drug trade in record numbers. 450,000 Mexicans are involved in the cultivation, processing, and distribution of drugs, according to a recent estimate. The current strategy also ignores the existence of a permanent subclass of over 20 million people who live on less than $2 a day and who view drug cultivation as a way out of, the only way out of, extreme poverty. Drug traffickers in Mexico are becoming more powerful due to historic recalcitrant patterns that recent governments have failed to confront. If Mexico cannot deal with its domestic corruption, it won't matter how many troops are trained, how many weapons are shipped, and how many helicopters are bought. Colombia has spent over $5 billion in US aid with mixed results. More security, but no end to drug production. So the lesson seems to be clear. The main objective of the war that the Mexican government is waging should not only be the destruction of the drug cartels, but the construction of the rule of law. People in Mexico often refer to el Estado de Derecho as if it existed. At the same time, this war will never be won, will never end with a certain triumph of the forces of good over evil if the demand for drugs in the United States is not stymied. To pretend that it can be won without dealing with drug consumption and demand-driven forces in the United States is to believe that one can stop an earthquake or a hurricane. For every drug trafficker who is caught, another one will emerge in his place. As Detective McNulty says in the final scene of The Wire, the American television series that recreated the futile war against drugs in Baltimore, as he gazes upon his devastated city with a mixture of love and sadness, he says, "It is what it is." His despair is shared by many Mexicans today as we pay a very high price for American veracity, but we also are paying a very high price for our inability to construct a prosperous, dynamic, inclusive, lawful country in which citizens are not propelled into illicit activities in order to survive, and criminals aren't protected by the government itself. Today, the Mexican state has been infiltrated by the forces it says it's combating. Today, the Mexican state declares that it is winning the war against the bad guys, when in reality it houses them. Where are the governors who have been accused, the municipal presidents who are being investigated, the attorney generals who are being pursued, the military members who are being accused? Drug trafficking has been built upon a dense network of corruption woven in Mexico over decades. To change that would entail facing truths that are deeper than the ones we've owned up to until today. It doesn't matter how many councils are installed, how many marches take place, how many promises are made, how many commitments are enlisted by the government. Mexico will continue to be the convulsive country it is today, until and unless criminals are actually punished. And that will never happen while the icons of impunity in Mexico remain at large, while those who break the law remain in power in Mexico instead of being removed from there, while those responsible for violence promoted from the state remain within its confines. Because what credibility can the recent Acuerdo Nacional por la Justicia y la Legalidad, a much trumpeted affair, what credibility can it have when Mario Marín, the governor of Puebla, protector of pedophiles, is asked to sign it? What credibility can an initiative to penalize kidnapping have when Ulises Ruiz, responsible for the death of over 16 people in the events in Oaxaca 2 years ago, is asked to sign it? What credibility can an effort to allegedly promote transparency have when Carlos Romero de Champs, the head of the Oil Workers Union, the owner of those $80,000 Rolex watches, is also brought in to sign it? What possibility of success can a crusade against crime have when the people who have committed crimes in the past are convened by the Mexican government to pursue that crusade? And we are told, oh, the root of everything is impunity. Crime has grown in Mexico because of impunity, says President Felipe Calderon. And he's right. But members of the political class in Mexico refer to impunity as if it were something delinked from their own behavior, as if impunity had not been institutionalized in Mexico over the years by the behavior of those members of the political class, as if the fault for Mexico's current situation lay only with, as we're told, apathetic citizens and a society that has lost its values, as if impunity had not been promoted and sanctioned over the years by venal governors and corrupt union leaders and presidents who have turned a blind eye, as if those seated in that famous Consejo de Seguridad had not contributed over the course of decades to make impunity a sine qua non condition of the Mexican political system, a system built upon the foundations of guaranteed impunity, shared complicity, assured protection, a system that survives despite Mexico's electoral democracy, because essential mechanisms for accountability, such as legislative re-election or re-election for any position in the Mexican government, that instrument does not exist. It is a system that prevails despite the change in power from the PRI to the PAN, because in reality it was never buried. So the real challenge for Mexico at a time in which you frequently hear the call, hasta aquí, no more, the real challenge would be to entail what no more would actually mean. It would entail combating impunity in the places where it was born, where it was conceived, and where it grew. And where was impunity conceived, and where did it grow in Mexico? Well, in Los Pinos, and in the Army, and in the National Teachers Union, and in the Oil Union, and in the Ministry of Gobernación, and in the Quinta Colorada of Tabasco, where Roberto Madrazo came from, and in the governorship of Puebla, and in the mansions of Arturo Montiel. Because if we are not capable of raising the bar to understand to what degree impunity in Mexico is destroying our collective house, we will never be able to deal with drug trafficking or any other criminal activity in Mexico. And in the meantime, one of the most negative byproducts of what's occurring today is something that you hear all the time in Mexico these days: the demand for order, the demand for a firm hand. In the face of increasing violence, Mexicans start looking towards those who they believe can combat it. And so, little by little, Mexico seems to be headed towards what I call a regrettable Putinization. Putinization, a return to a mental place where nostalgia is felt for strong leaders con pantalones, comparable to Vladimir Putin and the urge for order that led to his installment in Russia years ago. And that temptation, I understand, emerges in the face of the decapitations, the grenades, the criminals who on a daily basis make obvious just how fragile the Mexican state has become. It may not be a failed state, but it is certainly an infiltrated state. And in the face of that panorama, you get more and more citizens willing to cede their newly gained democratic freedoms if they obtain security in exchange. Where in every cafe conversation in Mexico City today, you will always hear someone who will say, let's get back to the days of the strong hand, la mano de hierro, the return of the PRI, because esto no pasaba con ellos. This didn't happen with them. In the absence of national cohesion and social cohesion, too many Mexicans demand a government with a firm hand. In the absence of effective institutions, too many Mexicans clamor for the return of a power who can save them from themselves. And therefore, it's not surprising that today democracy in Mexico has become associated with anarchy, with weakness, with insecurity. As the polls reveal, people begin to clamor for the return of a Mexican Putin, someone who can govern in the way that he did, a solution that offers continuity, security, stability, control. And who is offering those things in Mexico today as I speak? The Old PRI, led by unsavory characters like Manlio Fabio Beltrones and Emilio Gamboa and Ulises Ruiz, offering the PRI with the pretty face of Enrique Peña Nieto, the governor of the state of Mexico, who is being portrayed as the PRI's probable presidential candidate for 2012, offering him, and behind him, the steel glove of Beltrones, the man who was the chief of staff of Fernando Gutiérrez Barrios, responsible for Mexico's security forces in the 1960s and the 1970s. And offering what? To the concesionarios, those who operate a public good in Mexico. As my Canadian husband says, the way to get rich in Mexico is ser el concesionario de un bien público. So what is the PRI offering to the concesionarios of a public good? The maintenance of their privileged position. What is the PRI offering to the TV duopoly? The maintenance of the duopoly. It is offering big business the reestablishment of order. It is offering the unions the preservation of their conquistas sindicales, of their derechos adquiridos, their acquired rights, including the renowned right in Mexico's teachers union to sell, inherit, or exchange your teacher's position for sexual favors. That is what the PRI is offering. The value of experience, even if it is anti-democratic experience. That is what Mexico is beginning to see in the electoral and political panorama that is emerging in the future. An alliance of the oligarchs and the forces of order, supported by a population that begins to lose, after only 8 years, its democratic fervor. The reestablishment of a firm but corrupt hand that governed Mexico for 71 years. And due to the dysfunctionality of Mexico's institutional arrangement, think about it for a moment. We have the worst of all worlds, presidential system, but with divided government and no re-election. That means that opposition parties have no incentive whatsoever to collaborate with the executive. So in order to obtain that collaboration, Felipe Calderon has been forced to collaborate with the PRI and seek agreements with the former ruling party to obtain reforms in Congress. But what has that led to? In order to obtain that collaboration, Calderon has had to offer carrots, constant carrots, such as the political survival of Ulises Ruiz or Mario Marin, carrots that turn him into a constant hostage of his adversaries. Adversaries who, yes, agree to pact with the president, but always in their own terms. The PRI has become for Felipe Calderon the enemy that he is forced to sleep with, even if he has to do so with a knife under the bed. Because the PRI, on the one hand, raises Calderon's hand, allows him to govern, recognizes the legitimacy of his presidency after the contested election in 2006. But at the same time, the PRI constantly twists Calderon's arm behind his back. And this is the old PRI. I'm not talking here about the cosmopolitan, techno-bureaucratic, Ferragamo tie-wearing, capable of flirting in multiple languages elite that characterized the Salinas and the Cedillo years. I'm talking about the old PRI, many of the vintage dinosaurs who are occupying key positions in the administration today. This is the PRI that Calderon has been forced to negotiate with, pact with. And this has been bad news for the president because, yes, he's obtained 5 agreements in Congress, but always empowering his enemy. He has obtained the agreements he needs, but making larger and larger concessions to a semi-loyal opposition that sometimes supports the president's initiatives, but always dilutes them in favor of the vested interests it's protecting. And walking in tandem with the representatives of the past, the president has been unable to break with that past. By allying himself with those who promoted some of the worst practices of the political system, he cannot break with those practices. By pacting with the old PRI, in the old PRI's terms, Felipe Calderon has contributed to the empowerment of the former ruling party. And what has the PRI been doing over the past 2.5 years? Reorganizing itself at the local level, at the state level, winning election after election, winning positions in the periphery with the hope of eventually reconquering the center, Los Pinos. It takes advantage of infighting within the National Action Party. It takes advantage of the collapse of the left in order to regain the political ground that it lost in the 2006 election. Almost 3 years after its dramatic defeat, once again in the presidential race, today the PRI is the second political force in the country, the real adversary for the National Action Party in the polls. It is not the PRD. And in contrast with the divisions that led it to lose in the last 2 presidential elections, today the PRI displays an extraordinary amount of discipline. It has surmounted ideological differences, personal differences under one banner, and that banner is to win the next election. And it's not returning. And by the way, if Beatriz Paredes, the current head of the party, were here, she would say, we're not returning because we never left. But the PRI is coming back as an electoral force, not because of what it offers, but because the vacuums it is filling. It is taking advantage of the PAN's inability to break with the past and set up a different kind of government. It is returning by default. It is returning with discredited leaders. It is returning because it can. And it is using all of the traditional mechanisms at its disposal. Money, intimidation, clientelistic mobilization, low levels of participation, the weakness of electoral institutions at the state level, and returning in the way it has done. The PRI is sending a powerful and quite negative message to Mexico. And what is that message? That in order to win, the PRI doesn't need to modernize itself. It can be and behave the same way in which it always has and still win. Because the pre-modern country that it governed is still there. The small priista, el pequeño priista, that so many Mexicans carry inside is still alive, is alive and well. That small priista, that inner priista, for whom paying taxes is an option, not an obligation. That inner priista for whom stopping at a red light is an option, not an obligation. That inner priista for whom corruption is not a deal breaker. Corruption is legitimate as long as it's shared. And the results of this are clear. Manlio Fabio Beltrones has turned into one of the most powerful men in the country, despite the leyenda negra, the black legend that clouds his name. That series of articles published by the New York Times over 10 years ago linking him to drug trafficking activities when he was governor of Sonora, a series that won the Pulitzer Prize. And beyond that, all recent surveys in Mexico report that Enrique Peña Nieto, the protector of Arturo Montiel and his mansions, is the second most popular politician in the country, just under Felipe Calderon. And that the level of acceptance of the PRI is growing. Now, how did we get here? Well, beyond what I've explained, there is an additional factor to consider. To a certain extent, what has occurred is also the responsibility of the left, of the dysfunctionality of the PRD, and of a left that to this day still does not know what it has to do with Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And what we see is the agony of a couple that doesn't know how to behave as one. Andrés Manuel López Obrador and the PRD confronted in a very uncomfortable marriage, each person in their own entrenched position, throwing plates, provoking fights, tearing each other apart. The radicals against the moderates, the intransigents against the colaboracionistas, the López Obradoristas against everybody else, emulating on a daily basis the wonderful movie by Ingmar Bergman, Scenes from a Marriage, and demonstrating as many problems as the protagonists of that film. A left that is unhappily married and because of that politically weakened. A left that has managed to transform the accumulation of an incredible amount of political capital in the election of 2006 to toss it to the wayside. A left that garnered, 33% of the vote, that is now below its historic level in every poll at 14 or 15%. And the costs that this left incurs are increasingly obvious. What this left has produced is the alliance PRI-PAN in the Congress, and it has also forced Felipe Calderón a seguir bailando con la más fea, to keep on dancing with the most unattractive party in the Congress because he's had no other choice. And worse yet, this behavior has put the PRD in a precarious position where day after day it loses votes and support and the possibility of changing Mexico from the left. And why is further change needed? Because the country's political system has become a hybrid combination of authoritarian remnants and newly established mechanisms for democracy and transparency. Unions, political parties, vested interests, public and private monopolies have not adapted to democratic circumstances. They have exploited them to their advantage by becoming veto centers, opposed to further political and economic reform. Mexico's relatively new democracy is haunted by the old demons of corruption, patrimonialism, rent-seeking, and the arbitrary exercise of power. And in the past, the problem with Mexico was its imperial presidency, was its hegemonic party, the centralization of power. The problem today is not too much power in the hands of the president or of a party. It is too much power seized, taken away from the presidency by those who want to maintain their privileged positions in the system. What the executive has relinquished or been forced to give up, vested interests have been quick to take. What the Mexican state is no longer able to assure, such as the monopoly of violence, drug traffickers and organized crime have taken advantage of. Mexico's democratization has stalled because of bad institutional design. A system that has, I insist, no mechanisms for accountability, and that leads to political parties that appear frequently far removed from citizens' demands, prone to making questionable decisions, beset by internal divisions, incapable of dealing with deep-rooted problems of lawlessness and inequality, and prone to authoritarian leadership, either on the left or on the right, that presents itself as a redemptive force capable of saving the country. Mexico today has a low-grade democracy characterized by parties that, yes, are very well financed, but not particularly representative, and by rules that allow elite rotation, but don't assure accountability because re-election is not allowed. In other words, there are now more players in the game. In the past, we had only the PRI. Now we have the PRD, the National Action Party, the PT, Convergencia, but the game is essentially the same game, an arrangement that benefits Mexico's political class much more than it does its citizens. And why is this a serious problem? Because I feel that I come from a privileged country. Mexico has an extraordinary geographic location. It has incredible natural resources. It is inhabited by many talented, hardworking people. And yet, despite that, time goes by and we don't seem to modernize, to evolve, to democratize, to grow as we should. And why is that the case? In order to provide some answers to that question, I'd like to ask you to accompany me on an intellectual journey, remembering that famous book by Madame Calderon de la Barca called La Vida en México, Life in Mexico, written a couple of centuries ago, in which she attempts to describe the characteristics of the country she's just arrived to. If Madame Calderon de la Barca were to write her book again today, she would have to change its title. It would have to be called Oligopoly Land, because from the minute she descended from the plane, she would face the symptoms of a dysfunctional political economy that the current crisis is only heightening. She would land in one of the most expensive airports in the world. She would be surrounded by people who carry her luggage, a monopoly, that control the service. She would take a taxi from a company, a monopoly, that has recently decreed a 30% increase in rates while the government stands aside. And if she had to get gas, she could only buy it at Pemex. In the hotel, there would be a 75% probability that she would eat a tortilla sold by only one distributor. And if she got a stomachache and went to a drugstore and had to buy medicine, she would discover that medicines in Mexico are more expensive than in many other places in the world. And if she called her husband long distance to complain about her situation, she would pay among the most expensive rates of any country in the OECD. And if she turned on the TV to distract herself, she would discover that there are only 2 networks. And in order to understand the situation that she's in, she would have to remember what the head of the central bank, Guillermo Ortiz, said a couple of weeks ago. Mexico has not figured out a way of using its resources efficiently. Or she would have to read the book Good Capitalism, Bad Capitalism, that explains why some countries prosper and are able to promote equality and prosperity, and others do not. And the answer, according to the authors, lies in the correct mix of state and market, of regulation and innovation. The key to success lies in the capacity to build democratic, innovative capitalism, and to favor that instead of other variants of capitalism that have much more negative consequences, such as state-led capitalism or oligarchic capitalism. And Mexico today is a classic example of what Joseph Stiglitz and others call crony capitalism, el capitalismo de cuates. The capitalism that is based not on competition, but on blocking it. Mexican capitalism is characterized by a network of privileges, and we call them posiciones dominantes, other words, monopolies and duopolies, and bottlenecks in key sectors for the development of any country. Telecommunications, financial services, transportation, energy. I'd include education in there. Bottlenecks in those sectors that are locking up the Mexican economy and making it increasingly inefficient. A mixture of state-led capitalism and oligarchic capitalism. Mexico is still far from implementing a kind of dynamic capitalism where the state does not do what it does in Mexico today, which is what? Protect privileges, defend fiefdoms, choose national champions at the expense of consumers, and allow the perpetuation of a small group of oligarchs with the power to veto any reform that might undermine their interests. Today, Mexico is paying a very high price for the badly implemented reforms of the 1980s and 90s. Reforms that did not produce a dynamic market economy due to the absence of effective regulation. Reforms that did not create dynamic, functional markets, despite the privatizations, the deregulation, the commercial, the free trade agreement with the United States. Instead of transparency and clear rules, discretionality prevailed between those in charge of carrying out those reforms and those who benefited from them. At that forum at the Senate in which I participated, the Minister of Finance, Agustin Carstens, someone who I like and respect, complained about telecoms monopolies in Mexico and how they were retarding growth. And I thought, these are welcome statements. The problem is that they arrive 18 years too late. 18 years after Teléfonos de México was privatized. And there are the results of perhaps well-intentioned reforms, but badly implemented. An economy that doesn't grow enough, a business elite that doesn't compete enough, an economic model that concentrates wealth and distributes very poorly the huge wealth that the country does have. Today, Mexico is being held back by an intricate web of privileges and business vetoes and union vetoes and dominant positions in the market. A network that operates on the basis of personal favors and concessions and collusion and regulatory protection that the business elite demands in order to invest and the government offers. And who are the beneficiaries of this? I'll give you a couple of examples. Someone who owns a corn distributor or the concessionaire of a private highway, or the buyer of a bank rescued with the bank bailout known as Fobaproa, or the main stockholder in Telmex, or the operator of an Afore, of a pension fund. These actors capture rents through the exploitation and manipulation of markets, and the consumers of Mexico contribute to the wealth of these rent seekers every time we pay our phone bill, our internet connection, our toll on the highway, a tortilla at a fixed price, a commission for our pension system, a commission for our credit card. Example after example of rents extracted through the manipulation of markets allowed by the Mexican government. And as you know, as the economists in this room know, what does rent seeking do? It accentuates inequality, it produces social costs, it retards development, it diminishes productivity, it elevates the transaction costs of an economy that in a competition for global competitiveness needs to diminish those costs. And what have these rent seekers done? They've erected high barriers to entry to their competitors, inhibiting innovation, inhibiting productivity, and what else? The concentration of wealth and power in these dominant players too frequently translates into unfair advantages, regulatory capture, and political decisions and public policies that benefit a small minority. It turns representatives of the public interest. It turns congressmen and senators into employees of the vested interests of the country. And it leads to the following questions that I ask myself as a Mexican every night. Who governs Mexico? Who governs Mexico? The Senate or Ricardo Salinas Pliego when he's able to block a legislative initiative that would have promoted competition in the banking sector by allowing small financial institutions to set up what are called corresponsales bancarios. He has blocked that. Who governs? The National Banking Commission or the banks that refuse to comply with obligations of transparency to benefit the consumer? Who governs? The Ministry of Education or El Bester Gordillo? Who governs? The Competition Commission or Carlos Slim, who once again, se ha amparado, has obtained a judicial stay vis-a-vis the initiative forcing him to offer interconnection rates at a lower tariff to his competitors? Who governs? Pemex or Carlos Romero de Champs, the head of the Oil Workers Union? Because in the face of these vacuums of authority, and in the face of regulatory capture, and in the face of decisions that frequently benefit a small minority, it's not surprising that people speak of Mexico as a state that has another state inside of it, or as an economy that doesn't have a government capable of regulating it in an effective fashion. That is what is condemning Mexico to mediocrity. It's not the fall in oil prices, and over again, the debate in Mexico over how to promote growth, how to promote investment, how to generate employment is ill-focused. The government says and thinks that the way to promote that is to invite the private sector to invest in key areas of the economy. And the private sector thinks that that's the panacea, that it be allowed to invest in energy, for example. But that would only be a partial solution to a deeper problem. Mexico's suboptimal economic performance is the result of its economic structure and of the political rules of the game that sustain that structure. A structure that I call top-heavy, heavy at the top. It has the shape of a pyramid, and too many benefits are concentrated at the top of that pyramid. A structure of complicity and collusion and rent-seeking that the government allows and that it benefits from. And of course, if Agustín Carstens were here, or Guillermo Ortiz were here, they'd say, of course growth is a priority for us. But I believe, having witnessed their actions, that growth is not a priority for the Mexican political class. It is a residual variable. I think what they have been trying to do, and it's painful to admit this as a Mexican citizen, is to promote stability and a minimum degree of progress, but without altering the basic correlation of forces in the Mexican economy, without changing that structure in a fundamental way. And the problem emerges when that model begins to create monsters, when that sort of government behavior produces certain people, certain businesses, certain monopolies, certain duopolies, certain unions that can no longer be controlled. When those creatures of the state, because the state created them, El Bester Gordillo and Carlos Slim are creatures of the state. Those creatures of the state are now devouring the Mexican state. Only through this framework can you understand, for example, that the Fox government gave Ricardo Salinas Pliego 500 million pesos back on the last day of Fox's government because it was interest that had allegedly been improperly charged to him. Only through this network can you understand why the Ministry of Transportation put out this wonderful communique applauding last year's alliance between Televisa and Telemundo, when in reality that alliance meant that there was not going to be a third or a fourth network, television network in Mexico. Only through this framework can you understand why no one in Mexico lifts a finger to sanction Televisión Azteca or Ricardo Salinas Pliego when they refuse to show the spots, the electoral spots, of the political parties, which by law they are forced to do. Or when no one lifts a finger to sanction Salinas Pliego for taking over El Cerro del Chiquihuite. You probably remember this. Only through this framework can you understand why the touted energy reform of last year did not touch at all the issue of the oil workers' union. And only through this framework can you understand why, in all probability, Carlos Slim will be allowed to have his own TV network without having been forced first to fulfill the conditions of his original concession. These are symptoms of a weak government. These are symptoms of a colluded government with effects that are increasingly onerous and obvious. A great deal of wealth, few beneficiaries. Stagnant growth, a country that seems to muddle through and limp sideways instead of running forwards. Vested interest, diluted reforms, very little competition, low competitiveness, concentrated power, a democracy that is not truly representative, a government that instead of domesticating the creatures it has created, now is terrified of them. And what are the consequences of this system? As Francis Hagopian's work on Brazilian elites has shown, where traditional elites are strong, democratic governance is not very good. Political parties tend to be captured, reforms tend to be minimalist, and in Mexico, the slow pace, the incrementalism of reform can be attributed to traditional elites that are using their power to block reforms that affect their interests or assure initiatives that promote their privileged status. So what would the Mexican government need to do to change this situation? We'll begin by regulating and reforming in name of the public interest, sending out clear signs of how they're going to deactivate those veto centers that are blocking economic growth and democratic consolidation. And who am I talking about here? Abusive monopolists and rapacious unions and blackmailing TV networks and privileged businessmen and their allies in the government. Calderon would have to take decisions, make decisions that would unleash economic growth and contribute to build markets, strengthen the regulatory capacity of the states, promote competition, assure competitiveness. In other words, use the capacity of the state that he has to contain those with more power than the government, more weight than the electorate, more interest than the public interest. And you might ask me, well, what specifically could he do? How much time do you have? I have a long list, and I will only list what I think would be some key solutions. A third network, una licitación de una tercera cadena pública tomorrow. The promotion of competition in broadband through the use of the network of the Federal Electricity Commission, the strengthening of regulatory organizations, the sanction to those who violate the terms of their concession, the creation of markets, functional markets, as we have done with low-cost airlines. I'm sure some of you have already benefited from that functional market in Mexico. In other words, measures that begin to dismantle those creatures of the state, that domesticate those creatures of the state. And the answer is a political answer. It's not an economic answer. It has to do with the inauguration of a new type of relationship between the state, markets, and society. And if we don't do that, if the Mexican political class is unable to construct the foundations of democratic capitalism in Mexico, it will condemn the country to suboptimal performance. It will condemn it to be forever a fertile terrain for populist movements against the establishment. It will condemn it to permanently limp sideways, held back by political institutions it's unable to remodel, public and private monopolies it is unable to dismantle, corporatist structures it is unable to democratize. It will be what President Calderon calls a country of winners, but where only the same people always win. A place where some of the largest business fortunes have been built on the basis of political protection and not innovation. A place where growth over the last decade was much lower than in many other countries in Latin America because of those bottlenecks that the Mexican government built and allowed to survive. A place where the miseries felt by my mythical Madame Calderon de la Barca are those that are experienced every day by millions of Mexicans facing airports and maleteros and taxis and gasoline and telephony and television. That consumer without a voice, that citizen without a name, that person, that citizen who pays month after month the highest phone rates of any country of the OECD. That student who pays month after month an internet bill that is higher than that of any person sitting in this room. That small, medium-sized company that pays month after month telecommunications costs that elevate its operation, the cost of its own operations and eat into its profits. Thousands of people standing outside Mexican banks wondering about the commissions that they cannot understand on their bill charged for basic services. Out there, unprotected, out there with options, out there. Victims of an economic and political system that is so dysfunctional, institutionalized by a political class that applauds the approval of reforms that do not deal with the heart of the problem. Presidents and cabinet ministers and congressmen and senators and businessmen who celebrate the consensus to not change, who celebrate the 5 mini reforms approved in this administration, showing a propension there with that to propose small measures, short-term solutions that elude the distortions of the economic system, that show a propension to implement public policies a pedacitos in order to reach an agreement to preserve the status quo. While the reality of Mexico is there. 600,000 people who've lost their jobs, negative growth, the position number 60 out of 134 in the Global Competitiveness Index, and a country that says it's reforming while it fails to do so. To conclude, Mexico doesn't grow and doesn't modernize and doesn't change because of the anti-democratic fashion in which power is used and shared. Because of the discretionary rules, the politicized rules that govern the economy, because of the survival of corporate structures that the government created and continues to finance, because of an economic model that channels oil rents to too many clienteles, because of a political system that we can celebrate in terms of the alternancia that it has brought, but it continues to be a political system that works very well for its parties, but very badly for its citizens. I call it a system of extraction without representation, creating a country inhabited by people forced to cross the border at the rhythm of 400,000 people a year, forced to dilute their hope, forced to diminish their expectations, forced to live with their palm outstretched, waiting for the next token from the next politician, forced to march in the streets because they believe that no one in the government listens to them, forced to distrust institutions because they feel no one represents them, forced to witness the common death of their dreams because Mexico, our home, my home, does not grow and change and move at the rate, at the speed at which it could and it should. It could and it should. Thank you very much.
we have time for some questions. I would just ask that people keep the questions brief so we can have as much discussion as possible. Yes?
Toward the end of your talk, you started talking about some recommendations for what would need to happen in order for Mexico to move off of this path. And I'm just wondering what you think Calderon could do today, where he would find the support to undertake such reforms should he choose to.
Well, I mentioned 5 of them, including the licitation of a television network. He wouldn't get support, of course, from Televisa and Azteca, who would try to boycott him. He would get support from a population that understands the way in which these veto powers are operating. I mean, I wrote a column on Monday with yet another policy proposal, and this is not far-fetched. The Mexican government is going to bail out a series of companies that acquired a huge amount of debt, that dabbled in derivatives and now face a critical situation. The Mexican government has just contracted a line of credit with the Federal Reserve. You're probably aware of this, $30 billion. The debt of Cemex, the cement company, is $20 billion. What could the Mexican government do in this circumstance? Condition the rescue, condition the bailout. Say to those companies, Cemex, Gruma, others, highly indebted, highly leveraged, in key sectors, in dominant positions, you do not get a cent of that money until you sell activos. You sell your position in Cements Chihuahua, you sell your assets so that you only control 40% of the particular market that you're in. I mean, that's a proposal, among others. I think that Calderon, if he were here, would say, yes, it's a very good idea, but it would create enormous animosity in the business class. And unfortunately, I'm fighting a war against drug traffickers. I cannot afford to have another front open at the same time. So he is directing all of his attention, all of his energy, all of his resources to that war. And unfortunately, what's probably going to happen to him is that as he does so, Mexican citizens are going to turn around and say, well, the PAN has been in office for 8 years. They haven't really altered the structure that I've diagnosed. And the country is in chaos. If they cannot change the structure fundamentally, and the country is in chaos, well, why not bring back those who really knew how to run things? I have some other public policy proposals, but I think they all head in the same direction, and they have to do with how do you control privileges? How do you open markets? How do you dismantle fiefdoms? And I think that if he did so, he would create much more support than he thinks he currently has. Yes.
Double-barreled question, but. I'm curious, you're talking about things that Calderon could do to make reforms. What about sort of more from a grassroots bottom-up standpoint, and what role has the transparency law played, if any, in potentially making room for more accountability from the bottom up? And I guess the other part of the question is the role of the United States in encouraging this direction.
I am a champion of civil society. One of the and of transparency. One of the prerequisites for getting a grade in my Mexican politics class at ITAM is you have to write a letter to your congressman, and you have to use the Freedom of Information law, get a request for public information. So I believe in those things. The problem in Mexico is that civil society can march, chant, scream, denounce, yell. I can write columns until the cows come home. And the problem is that the political elite can basically ignore us because there's no cost to ignoring civil society, because there's no re-election. I mean, we have created a perverse system. If you ask me what should people be marching for every element of accountability at their disposal. That would include, obviously, re-election. It would include mechanisms such as referendums, plebiscites, revocación del mandato, what happened here with Gray Davis, what is it called?
Recall.
Because, I mean, why is Mario Marin still in Puebla, despite that taped conversation we all heard, in which we came to know that he was in cahoots with a pedophile businessman who had given him the order to arrest Lidia Cacho. I'm sure it's a case you're all familiar with. Why is he still there? Because there are no mechanisms for citizen empowerment, for elevating costs. I think the transparency law is a great thing. What has it done? It has made us more aware of the abuses. Incredible information has come as a result of that law. The problem is the abuses are revealed and they're never sanctioned. We now know what happens in the Mexican government, how resources are ill-spent, how conflict of interest riddle the system. We have that information, but that information in and of itself has been unable to change the way in which the system performs. Now, the role of the United States, in what regard? Because there are so many.
Obama, let's say. I mean, pressure, government to government pressure.
On what issue?
The democratization, the kinds of things that you're talking about that you would suggest Calderon would.
I think that Mexico caught the Obama administration by surprise. I think that Obama was focused on it. I saw an interview with him where he said recently that if someone had told him that Iraq would be number 10 on his list of problems a year ago, he never would have believed it. But you see the dimensions of the problems that he's facing here. I do not think Mexico was a priority or something that kept him awake at night. It wasn't even mentioned in the campaign, only in reference to NAFTA. And I think as a result of the increasing violence, the media coverage, the congressional hearings, he was forced to look down. And that led to Hillary Clinton's trip. And I think it's led to, at the very least, a change in rhetoric. He's adopted the rhetoric of co-responsibility, of understanding that there's a demand issue, that the U.S. is supplying weapons, that the U.S. is not doing enough to clamp down on the transfer of cash across the border. I think those are the areas in which the United States needs to work on. In other words, domestic politics and domestic policy issues that have a huge impact on Mexico. I'm disappointed by the position of the administration on the ban on assault weapons. It was a campaign position. If you recall, Obama said that he would reinstate the ban. Now the Obama administration has changed its position, saying there's no support on Capitol Hill, too costly, instead we'll try to do other things, such as send agents to the border. I don't think once the guns are sold, trying to trace them and trying to stop them from crossing the border is going to be, I think, futile. I do think more American assistance is required, but not just guns and bombs and helicopters. It has to do with what I mentioned in this talk. Support in terms of constructing effective institutions. How do you establish an effective judiciary? How do you train policemen? How do you create an infrastructure that holds up a real rule of law, something that Mexico has never really had? I don't see Obama trying to intervene in domestic politics. I don't see him conditioning aid, but I don't think that if Mexico, as I said in the talk, does not deal with its issue of domestic corruption, we can continue to fight drug traffickers forever, and it will still be a very unstable, very violent place.
As many of you know, when we have many of our events at the Center for Latin American Studies, we ask for questions over the internet electronically. So I'd like to read one of these questions, which is, please discuss the impact of NAFTA on the Mexican economy, and I presume pressure to grow and sell drugs generated by the crisis in the Mexican agricultural economy.
I'm happy to answer the question, but I don't want to. I'm not an expert on NAFTA, but what I will say is I think you have to view NAFTA not as an independent variable, but a dependent variable on the economic development plan that Mexico has followed. NAFTA, too many expectations were placed on it as an instrument for growth, as an instrument of modernization, as an instrument that would propel Mexico into the first world. But the problem is that instrument was inserted into the structure that I have already discussed. So what happened? You ended up liberalizing a country that had no real markets, or where markets were already concentrated. So what you ended up doing was strengthening, bolstering the position of conglomerates that had access to credit, that had technological expertise, that simply solidified their position. And then the downside of that is that you wiped out a large part of Mexico's domestic industrial base of small and medium-sized businesses and created a huge crisis in agriculture. Now, I don't think that NAFTA is the cause of the problems in the Mexican agricultural sector. The cause is that Mexico has not made the modernization of its agricultural sector a priority. And what do I mean by that? I teach Barrington Moore's book, The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, where he argues that democracy is closely linked to agricultural modernization. In other words, that you have to turn ejidatarios into farmers. You have to turn people who cultivated the land simply for self-consumption into people who produce for the market. I think that was the intention of the reform to Article 27. And it was the intention behind opening up Mexico to NAFTA. But what happened? The crisis set in. Cedillo couldn't have cared less about agriculture. It became a residual issue, and the Mexican government did not help farmers to confront the transition. Through what? Through infrastructure, through investment, through everything that needed to be done to modernize agriculture in Mexico. That didn't happen. And so what did happen is that the instrument of NAFTA simply reinforced pre-existent inequalities. And it heightened them in areas where people, such as in agriculture, began to be increasingly left behind.
There was a question right in back. Yes.
Hi. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that Mexico will become a net importer of oil by 2020. And this year, the federal government got about 40% of its revenue from exporting oil. So I was hoping you could comment on some of the what's politically feasible right now. You commented a little bit on the energy reform of 2008, but I wanted to hear what you had to think about, what do they need to do in the future to sort of reverse the trends that they're experiencing right now?
Oh, I don't want them to reverse the trends. I want Mexico to run out of oil. I do. I know it's politically incorrect to say that, but I think oil has financed Mexico's paralysis. Oil has become a double-edged sword. Oil, because what has happened? When a government gets the revenues it needs by selling oil, it doesn't have to educate its population. It doesn't have to modernize its infrastructure. It doesn't have to listen to its citizens. And the Mexican government has been receiving these revenues that are enough to pay itself and its clienteles. Thomas Friedman argues in that article I like a lot. The first law of petropolitics: the higher the price of oil, the lower the impetus for reform and modernization. If you want to understand why Mexico did not reform substantively over the last 30 years, there's a correlation with the price of oil. Once we run out of oil, what will have to start to happen? To begin with, the Mexican government will have to start charging taxes, really charging taxes, which it doesn't have to do right now. It extracts them from people like me, from the middle class, married to a Canadian for whom paying taxes is a moral obligation. But not paying taxes in Mexico is completely rational. It would have to start charging taxes. And what do taxes do? They create a virtuous cycle of accountability and responsiveness. I mean, every time I hear Obama say in a speech, what I'm doing with your taxpayer money, I envy that sort of rhetoric because you never hear it in Mexico. No politician ever has to say what he's doing with your taxpayer money. So the government would have to start charging taxes, and it would have to start doing what? Educating Mexicans so that they could produce something that had value in the market. What we produce now is oil that we extract and immigrants who cross the border. So I'm not concerned about Mexico running out of oil. I hope that happens in my lifetime, because I think that would hasten the impetus for reform and force the government to behave in a different way and use scarce resources in a more intelligent fashion. Yes.
Actually, unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, so I'll have to take it from someone else. Yes.
Yeah, so it seems to me like we need patience for Felipe Calderon, because he said that you need to go after the government officials who are also corrupt and not just the capos, for example. But isn't it true there have been certain government officials such as his name is Miguel Colorado Gonzalez, head of the CIEDO, who were given information to the Beltran labor cartel, and he got caught, and a bunch of other government officials. So I think we have to be patient, because little by little other people are still getting caught.
People from the CIEDO were arrested. Calderon has clearly dealt with corruption within the police and security forces at some level. I'm talking about a different sort of corruption. I'm talking about the corruption provided by governors. I'm talking by the protection provided by governors. I'm talking about the protection provided by municipal presidents. I mean, a case happened 3 days ago. The Archbishop of Durango declares in a press conference that El Chapo Guzman, the second most wanted man in the world, lives a mile ahead of Guanaceví. What happens the next day? The national newspapers that print the story are collected in the state of Durango by the governor so that no one has a chance to read them. The local TV networks do not even cover the story. What is this telling you? Now, I think Calderon has been reluctant to take on high-level political corruption because some of that corruption might involve members of his own party, but will probably involve members of the PRI. And Calderon's priority was to get accords in Congress. So he could not use a stick vis-a-vis the people that he wanted to sit down and get reforms passed through Congress with their help. I think now after the midterms, after the PRI probably wins the midterms and Calderon understands that the next 3 years are not going to be about reforms, we are going to see more of an impetus to combat high-level corruption. I wouldn't even be surprised if there were a PRI governor charged with providing protection to drug traffickers 2 weeks before the midterm elections.
Actually, we're out of time.
Oh, one more.
Okay,
one more.
One more.
I think that after the midterm elections, it will be also a test for the PRI. I think that the PRI is not accountable if the PRI does not change. It will also dismantelization and the final collapse of this party. So you need to change, no?
Oh, I think you're so young.
That's a compliment.
I mean, yes, in an ideal world, that would be the case. But what is this PRI going to try and do? I think it is going to try and dismantle and weaken every single autonomous institution we've been able to create over the past decade in order to assure that they are not kicked out of power ever again. I think that's what happened.
Had that happen?
Well, we've already seen what happened with the jewel in the crown, the Federal Electoral Institute, and the politicking that led to its current weakened state. We've already seen, I mean, I think it was a very bad thing for Felipe Calderon to remove the head of the Transparency Institute and make him Minister of Education. It was a blow to the autonomy of an institution that is gaining prestige and credibility. And I think you'd begin to see much more of that. Now, that doesn't mean that people like me are going to give up the fight. I mean, I don't want you to leave here feeling depressed or disheartened or feeling, you know, el último que se vaya, apague la luz. What I want you to feel is indignant, especially the Mexicans sitting in this room. Indignant with that sort of good indignation that is an integral component of participatory citizenship. Because what I've always said about Mexico is that we're enamored of what Octavio Paz called el amor a la forma. You know, el beso, la concordia, la mano extendida. We're not a country that has the capacity to look at itself honestly. And I think that if we don't look at ourselves honestly, we will continue to reform at the margins. We will not address the heart of the matter. And we will continue to be a country that I've described, a country that works very well for its political class. I always say that there's no better job on the planet than to be a Mexican politician. You know, public funding, zero accountability. And we don't have re-election. No hay reelección, pero sí hay trampolín. You know, there's no re-election, but there is a springboard. You go from the Chamber of Deputies to the Senate to a municipal presidency to a governorship without ever having returned to face the voters who took you there. So what I want to take with you is, too many people, I think, breathed a sigh of relief when Vicente Fox was elected and thought, democracy, oh, you know, we're done. You know, Mexico, don't have to worry about that country again. There is a cause for concern in everything that I've outlined, but that means that the job is not done. That this is a country still under construction. It has a little orange cone on the top of its head. And there are people in this room who need to play an important role in the construction, the reconstruction of their country. Thank you very much.
I'd like to briefly point out that in the next issue of the Berkeley Review of Latin American Studies, available online in mid-May, Professor Dresser has an article going over some of the material she discussed here today. We look forward to seeing you at future events.